Hello everyone, welcome back to a new video. In our last video, we pretty much covered HTML, looking at, what HTML is, how do you make a structure of a web page, and as you probably saw after, experimenting for yourself, there was no crazy designing that was being done when you use HTML, and that is where CSS comes into play. So let's go ahead and learn what CSS is. So we're going to meet the language that is going to give you a design to what you see online. So everything you see online is used or designed in this language. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's basically just a language that's used to design your HTML documents that you create. So this language is used to pretty much tell the browser what it needs to display within those HTML elements. So remember that your HTML is your structure while your CSS is your design. So these two go hand in hand to pretty much create a web page. So CSS is used to change your colors, fonts, spacing, layout, and another range of things. So within each of these categories, there's a lot of things you can do. But first, let's see how you actually integrate CSS with HTML. So there's these three different types: inline styles, internal CSS, and external CSS. And we will go through those separately. So your inline styles are going to be the ones that you actually write directly within the HTML tag. So this was one that I introduced in the last video of HTML. So you can pretty much embed CSS within your HTML tag. So that's used if you want to save space or if you want to control a specific element. So for that example, let's say you have multiple paragraphs within your page and you want each of them to have a different style. Then you would do something like this, because that will allow you to control each individual paragraph or each individual element that you attach that styling to. Now with your internal CSS, that is going to be the one that you have to add a section within the head tag of your HTML file. So the head tag is the one that lives at the very top of your HTML tag or your HTML document. And if you see in this example, there's the head tag there, and then inside of the head tag, you use a style block or a style tag. And inside of the style block that you create is where you would put your CSS. So if you see here in the screenshot example, we have P, and that is the structure it takes. So you do need to use the curly braces. But inside of that, you would pretty much separate it based on what you want to do. And we will get into that a little bit deeper into the video. And lastly, you can also do all of your CSS within its own CSS file. So you could create, just like you create a .html file, you can create a .css file, and that file will contain all of your designing components for a specific web page. And many times people use this route when they do not want to have a long page full of code. So it just allows it to be a little bit easier for you, and it makes your documents overall a lot shorter because you do not have the designing and the structure component in one. So you can do this as well, but this is typically used with the more advanced programmers. Now, we covered how you can integrate it into HTML, but let's cover how to actually do it. And in this case, the syntax that you're seeing on the screen is when you are using it within the last two options, not when you have it in line. So the selector, property, and a value. So we'll go into those each separately. So first, your selector is going to be whatever elements you're styling. So for example, that would be a P, that would be a H1, that would be H2. The actual element that is going to be styled. So that means whatever HTML structure or tag that you want to style is the selector. For your property, that is going to be the style that you're trying to change. And each selector has different properties. So, for example, if you want to change the color, you would say color, and then you see value, that would be whatever the value is. So, in that case, let's say color is blue and the font size is 16 pixels. But regardless of that, you must remember that if you're using the last two options of your external or internal CSS, that they do need to be inside of curly braces, and each rule or each property that you're doing has to end in a semicolon. So we'll look at some more examples. So here, this would be an example of either if you did the internal or the external CSS. But basically what this is saying is P. So any paragraphs that you have on your page, it's basically saying that you want to make the color of the paragraphs blue and you want the font size to be 16. So that's what this is saying. Of course, you can continue on and get deeper into designing, which we'll see in a little bit, but this is just a simple example of what it would look like for your internal or your external CSS. So let's get into the deeper look into the selectors. So you have an element selector. Now your element selectors, again, are the ones that you are selecting based on your HTML tags that you created. So for example, your P, H1, or your div. You can pretty much state one of these and it would style every single one on the page. So for example, if you were to use the internal CSS at the top, and then let's say you say H1 using the syntax with the curly braces, you say H1 color equals red. If you have more than one H1 on your HTML page, they will all show up as red. You would have to specify this one is to be red or this one is to be blue. And how would you do that? That would be using another selector type, or that would be simply using the inline CSS. So here's another example, pretty much the same as the one we used before, but in this case it's saying if you have an HTML file with multiple P's and H1s, that all of them would take this designing component based on what they are. So all the paragraphs will be blue with 16 font, and all of the H1s in your HTML document will be center, text align, and dark red. So that is one way to do it with your element selector. And then you have something called a class selector. So this will pretty much be used to design elements that are within a class. So it would just pretty much apply the same style to everything that is in that class. So a class looks like this. So how do you create a class? You pretty much would use the class attribute within a tag. So if you see at the top half, you have two elements. You have a P and a span. And basically what it's saying is the class name is going to be considered highlight. So it says class equal highlight. And of course you can change the class to whatever you want it to be named. But when it comes to the CSS, all you would have to do is use dot, whatever that class name is, and then you would place whatever formatting you're doing in that class. So that is another way you can control how you are designing your elements by placing it in a class. In this case, do you have to do it this way? No. But if you're trying to have more control over your designing components, then this will come in handy. And lastly, you have your ID selector. So yes, you can technically give your elements in an HTML document an ID, and then you can use that ID to pretty much say, okay, hey, this is what I want to do with that ID. So, for example, if you see in the top, we have H1 and it has a ID of main title. If you see at the bottom for the CSS, we pretty much are using the same ID name, except we're placing a hashtag in the front, and then we're controlling it that way. But pretty much you see that the overall syntax as far as the contents within it, color, text align, we've seen those examples before. And please take note that each one does end with a semicolon, and they are within those curly braces. So that is important. Now, in this case, whichever route you feel is simpler for you to understand, by all means use. If you feel like you want to experiment with them all, obviously do that as well. But that is going to be very useful in this case. So, your colors. Colors, you've seen in all the examples, they pretty much brought up various colors that you can, create or design your code with. So you can use, in terms of telling the computer what color, the actual color name, the hex value, or the RGB value, which we have covered the RGB value in other videos. So I'm just going to briefly give an example of it. The first one, H1, is using the color name. So pretty much if you know whatever color you want to use, then you can use that. The one for P is using the hex value, and you can find like the hex value colors online. You can just search hex color values and it'll bring you up a ton of different colors, shades, etc. Same for your RGB values. Uh, Pretty much, that goes red, green, and blue. So that's just pretty much saying what value of red, green, or blue that you're adding on. The last one is another RGB value. That one goes just a little bit more intense into, the strengthening of the color, but you don't necessarily have to use that one. But that is just an example of how you can design or change your colors of different components in your CSS. So then you can also change your fonts. So this is where you can get fancy with how your text looks. And with this, you would use font family, font size, font weight, and font style, which we'll cover each one independently. So your font family, let's just think of that as if you go into Microsoft Word and change your overall font. If you look at the screenshot, pretty much you see it says, for example, let's go to P. It says font family, Arial, Helvetica, Sans Serif. So when you see that there's multiple, this is a case where you don't necessarily know what fonts a computer has on them. Of course, you may think that all computers have the same fonts, but sometimes that's not the case. So in this case, the reasoning that there are multiple fonts is because it's just saying, hey, if this user doesn't have Arial, let's try to see if it has Helvetica. And if it doesn't have Helvetica, let's see if it just has any type of sans serif font on it. So for the P example, Arial and Helvetica are very specific to the font, but sans serif is just saying at that point it's like a default. It's just saying, okay, just choose any sans serif that is on that computer. So the same with all three of these. If you see each of them end with a general font family, so serif, sans serif, or monospace, within those families they have multiple fonts. And pretty much all it's saying is, hey, if you don't have the specific font that I have on my computer, on the other user's computer, just use any one within it. So, do you have to set it up like this? Not necessarily, but it is always the best practice to have your default font value, which would be, monospace or sans serif at the very end. All right, so font size. You should already know pretty much what font size is. For many of you, you know the one PX. That's how it is like on your Word documents. So pixels is just saying your fixed size. Now, the difference between the ones you see on here is that pixels are a little bit harder to control, whereas your percentages are a little bit more flexible for control. So if you're trying to have flexibility in your designing, I would recommend probably using the percentage one, but pix is fine. And here's an example of how you would do each of those. So just kind of think of the percentage one as like, you know, if you were to do, say, 90%, then just think of that as that's almost the maximum. If you do 10%, that's pretty much the minimum. So the range is from smallest to largest in that case, and that's just how the control would work for that. Whereas for the pixels, you would kind of have to understand the pixel value, like how it looks on Word document for it to translate on the HTML document, which many of us don't necessarily, know what all pixel sizes look like on the Word document, because many times you just keep it, at your 11 or your 12 point font. So that's pretty much the case with that one, which is why some people would say the percentage is a little bit easier to use because you can kind of just get an idea of how big it's going to be based off a percentage. But again, totally up to you. Font weight. So this is if you just want to add bolding to your text. So if we look at the example here, you see font weight. You can actually specify it being bold, or you can give it an actual number value. And the number value obviously is going to control how big that bold looks. So the word bold just gives it your standard bold, as if you were going to use it on a Word document, whereas your font weight is giving you like a heavy bold that you're controlling. So either or works and will bold your font. All right, and then we have font style. So this is really you don't necessarily have to use this one, but this is for if you want to use italics. So this is pretty much just to make some sort of italics within your code. So again, if you feel the need to use italics, then you use font styles. If not, you can pretty much disregard this. So overall, here is an example with all of those different types of font designing that you could do. At the top, you see we had the font family telling what type of font we want it to look like. We're setting it to 32 pixels. They're making it bold, and they're also making it italic in this example. So do you have to do all of these different font designings for each element? No. It's totally up to you. For example, you don't have to touch font at all if you don't want to. You can just keep it simple and default depending on what your computer sets it as. Or if you just want to make your font size big, you can do that and not even specify anything else. So in this case, you can pick as many as you want or as less as you want. It really doesn't matter. It just depends on what you want your design to look like. So you can also do your text alignment. So again, just like a Word document, in many cases, either you're going to use the left or the center. So here's an example of that. And pretty much you just place it within your CSS block. So you see text, dash align, center. And that's pretty much saying it's going to center all your H1s with a specific color and a specific font. And that's what this text is saying. So just to get into spacing within CSS a little further, we kind of touched this briefly in HTML, but within CSS, you can put the actual spacing within it. So there's typically two ways you can do that. There's the margin spacing and padding spacing. So margin is the one that, or the spacing that is actually outside of an element, so like around the element. And padding is actually considered inside of the element. So, for example, if you were to have some sort of text box, padding would be used to like design the inside of the text box, or to do something inside of that text box. Whereas margin would be designing outside of the text box, so on the outer side of the text box frame. And that is kind of a explanation or a visual you can think of when it comes to the two. So you can technically use them both at the same time. It's just going to add a lot of cushioning and spacing, but you can do that. And then if you use it this way, it's pretty much going to say, let's add a 10 pixel padding around each side. You can control it to add, or specify which area of your code is to have the padding. So let's say if you want it on the top, on the bottom, on the side, you can control that. In this case and in this video, I'm not necessarily going to go too deep into that because that would be more into the designer's world of things, but just know that you can specify the padding for each side individually, but in this case, it's just going to cover all sides. All right. Then you can change your background of your elements. So if you wanted to have a specific color in the background, you can even put an image. There's repeat and there's size. So this would be an example of that. The most important part, or the most common ones used, would be your background color or a background image. So if you want a background image to be on, your website, then you can do that. Or if you just want, let's say, the whole background of the website to be a specific color, then you can use background color. So in this case, you see body, and it says background color. That's pretty much saying it wants the whole web page to be like gray, or whatever color you specify it to be. So in this case, the two common ones used are the background color and the background image. As far as the image goes, that works the same way as how I showed you to do images in HTML. That image has to be in the same folder as the files for it to appear. So again, just a reminder of a way of looking at how HTML and CSS work together. Your HTML is going to be the skeleton, while your CSS is the skin. So pretty much all humans have the same skeleton. They pretty much have the same consistency, and their body is formed in the same manner. But everyone has a different look, and that's where your CSS comes into play. So I do not look like you, and you do not look like me. And that's where CSS is important, because CSS allows you to control what that actual design looks like. So for all web pages, it's important to have HTML and CSS. There is also JavaScript, which comes into action. In this case, and in this tutorial, I'm not going to cover it, but JavaScript is when you putting motion to the body. So that would be, we're human, we have a skeleton, we're all, designed differently, but we all can move differently as well. And that's where JavaScript comes in play. JavaScript is more so dealing with the movement. So overall, what did we cover? We pretty much covered how your web pages are designed. So when you see websites on the internet, they are using CSS to design them. And we pretty much covered the basics of CSS for you to design, your websites. Again, we're not going in deep dive into HTML and CSS. We're pretty much doing the basics just to get you started. There's a lot more components that I did not mention in both videos. Both of these are pretty much covering at least what you need to know to get started, to have fun with designing. But of course, it does go very, very deep in both languages, depending on how fancy you're trying to get. And in this case, there are classes that pretty much spend a whole semester just doing HTML, CSS, and JavaScript designing. But for this course, it's not that case. So we're just pretty much covering the basics and, just giving you enough to work or design a simple page yourself. Now, if you feel the need to learn more, of course, feel free to look at other videos or, look on the internet as well for that. But pretty much now you know how to create a website using HTML and CSS. So HTML to build it and CSS to design it. So hopefully you found this interesting and you make some sort of website that you hope to use in the future, or just want to experiment with it a little bit more. So that's all I have for today, and I will see you in the next video.